The neon pulse of Seoul blurred into streaks of jagged light as the armored limousine tore through the rain-slicked streets of Gangnam. Inside the plush, leather interior, the air didn't smell like the expensive champagne from the gala they had just fled. It smelled of ozone and cold, sharpened steel. Zarya Monroe sat perfectly still, her ivory silk gown stained with a spray of crimson that wasn't hers. She didn't look like the trembling orphan who had been sold to a disabled monster months ago. Her eyes, once filled with the learned helplessness of a servant, were now as cold and calculating as the diamonds weighing down her throat. Beside her, Han Yimin sat upright, no longer confined to the wheelchair that had served as his greatest tactical ruse. He was a shadow made flesh, his tattooed hands moving with lethal precision as he checked the chamber of a silver handgun. "They think because I was arrested, the dragon's nest is empty," Yimin said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "They think you are the soft spot in my armor, Zarya, my only weakness." A sudden, violent jolt rocked the car as a black SUV rammed their rear bumper. Zarya didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She simply reached into the hidden compartment of the door, pulling out a tablet that displayed the real-time thermal signatures of the hunters trailing them. "Then let's correct their mistake, Yimin," she replied, her voice steady and devoid of mercy. "They didn't come for a victim. They came for a queen, and I have a debt to collect from the Kingsleys that can only be paid in ruins." The hunt had officially turned. The orphan was gone. The matriarch had arrived. "Hello, family. Before we continue, I would like to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here." Now let's go back into the story. The transition from a life of servitude to one of absolute power did not happen in the ballrooms of Seoul. It happened in the quiet, shadow-drenched hours of the early morning within Yimin's private sanctum. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the Han estate, filled not with art or silk, but with a wall of glowing monitors and stacks of decrypted files. Yimin stood by the window, his tall, athletic frame casting a long shadow over the mahogany floor. He was no longer the man Zarya had first met, the one who sat in a wheelchair as a shield against the world's prying eyes. Here, he was the architect of an empire, and today he was becoming her teacher. Zarya sat at the desk, her fingers hovering over a keyboard that controlled a network of information more vast than she could have imagined. She looked at the data flowing across the screens, bank transfers, shipping manifests, and encrypted communications from the very people who had once stepped over her like she was nothing. "In the syndicate, Zarya, people think power is found in the barrel of a gun," Yimin said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that seemed to vibrate in the small space. He walked toward her, resting his hands on the back of her chair. His presence was a heavy, protective weight. "A bullet can kill a man, but information can kill a legacy. It can erase a name from history before they even know they're under attack." He leaned over her shoulder, his scent of expensive tobacco and cold rain enveloping her. He pointed to a specific node on the screen, a shell company registered to Victor Kingsley. "Your aunt and uncle believe they are safe because they have hidden their debts behind a maze of legal papers. They think they can use the law to reclaim you like a piece of lost luggage." Zarya watched as he navigated through the layers of the Kingsleys' financial deception. It was a messy, desperate web of fraud and embezzlement. For years, they had lived off her parents' stolen legacy, and now that the well was dry, they were coming for hers. "I don't want to just stop them, Yimin," Zarya whispered, her eyes hardening with a fire that hadn't been there weeks ago. "I want them to feel the weight of every floor I scrubbed. I want them to understand that the girl they sold didn't just survive. She evolved." Yimin's hand moved from the chair to her shoulder, his thumb grazing the side of her neck. "Then you must learn to see the patterns. Look at the timing of these transfers. They aren't just hiding money, they are paying for protection. They've reached out to the Kusin faction, my rivals. They are offering you as a prize in exchange for my downfall." He pulled up a second screen, revealing a series of intercepted messages. Zarya felt a cold shiver trace her spine as she read her aunt's words. "She's just an orphan. Take the husband out, and the girl will do whatever we say." "They still think I'm that girl," Zarya said, a sharp, humorless laugh escaping her lips. "That is your greatest advantage," Yimin replied, his intense gaze locking onto hers. Let them believe you are the victim. Let them think you are the weak link in the hand chain. While they prepare for a war of muscles, we will execute a war of minds. I'm going to teach you how to freeze their assets, how to turn their allies against them, and how to leave them with nothing but the clothes on their backs. For the next 6 hours, the room became a classroom of the dark arts. Yimin showed her how to track a person's digital footprint until their every secret was laid bare. He taught her the psychology of the vulture, how to spot when an enemy was bluffing and when they were truly desperate. Zarya was a natural. Her years of surviving the Kingsleys had given her a heightened sense of intuition. She had spent a lifetime reading the moods of her abusers just to stay safe. Now, she was using that same skill to plan their total destruction. As the sun began to peek over the Seoul skyline, painting the room in shades of violet and gold, Yimin stepped back. He looked at Zarya, who was now expertly rerouting a Cusan shipment to a dead-end port in the Philippines. She wasn't the girl who had cried on the marble floor on her wedding night. She was a weapon he had helped forge, and she was sharper than any blade in his armory. "You're ready for the first stage?" Yimin murmured, pulling her up from the chair. He looked at her with a mix of pride and something deeper, a possessive devotion that made Zarya's heart skip. "The Kingsleys are filing their lawsuit tomorrow. They think they are walking into a courtroom. They don't realize they are walking into an execution." Zarya leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. She could hear the steady, rhythmic beat of the man who had given her a throne instead of a cage. "Let them come," she said, her voice a cold promise to the wind. "I've been a slave to their name for long enough. It's time they learned what happens when a Monroe becomes a Han." Yimin kissed the top of her head, his grip tightening. The training was over. The hunt was about to begin. The Seoul Central District Court was a monolith of cold granite and glass, a place where truth was often less important than the theater of power. Zarya sat in the back of the sleek black sedan, watching the swarm of reporters gathered at the entrance. They were there for the scandal of the century, the impoverished, Kingsley family taking on the trillionaire Han's syndicate to rescue their kidnapped niece. "Ready?" Yimin asked. He sat beside her, his hand resting over hers. He was back in the wheelchair today, a calculated move to maintain the public illusion of his vulnerability while Zarya stepped into the light. "I've waited 2 years to look her in the eye without having to look at the floor," Zarya replied, her voice like sharpened velvet. "I'm more than ready." As they entered the courtroom, the air turned electric. Aunt Deborah Kingsley sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a somber black suit that screamed manufactured grief. Beside her, Victor and Julian looked on with expressions of practiced solemnity. The moment Deborah saw Zarya, she let out a choked sob, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "My poor, dear girl," Deborah cried out as the judge entered the room. "Look at what they've done to her, dressed her in diamonds to hide the chains. Your Honor, we are here to reclaim the Monroe legacy that this criminal organization has coerced her into surrendering." Zarya watched the performance with a detachment that surprised her. She saw the way the Kingsleys' lawyer presented the evidence. Fraudulent documents suggesting Zarya had been under duress when she signed over her parental inheritance to the Han Group. They painted a picture of a predatory mafia boss and a helpless, brainwashed orphan. When it was Zarya's turn to speak, the room fell into a suffocating silence. She didn't walk to the stand like a victim. She walked with the measured, lethal grace Yimin had taught her. She didn't look at the judge. She looked directly at Deborah. "Aunt Deborah," Zarya began, her voice echoing with a clarity that made Victor Kingsley flinch. "You speak of coercion. You speak of chains. But let's talk about the 2 years I spent in your home. Let's talk about the inheritance you claim I stole. The same inheritance that paid for Julian's gambling debts and Arabella's penthouses while I slept in a room smaller than your walk-in closet." "Lies," Julian shouted, but the judge's gavel silenced him instantly. "I have submitted a new set of documents to the court this morning," Zarya continued, signaling to the Han legal team. On the large monitors in the courtroom, a series of financial logs appeared. "These aren't just bank statements. These are the records of the Kingsley Charity Fund," which, as it turns out, was a front for money laundering and the systematic draining of my parents' estate long before I ever met my husband. The color drained from Deborah's face. She looked at the screen, her eyes widening as she saw the very transfers Zarya and Yimin had decrypted in the sanctum. It was a digital map of their greed, laid bare for the world to see. "You didn't file this lawsuit to save me," Zarya said, leaning forward, her gaze pinning her aunt to her seat. "You filed it because you're bankrupt. You filed it because you realize that the girl you sold is the only one who knows where you buried the bodies, metaphorically and financially. You didn't set a trap for me, Deborah. You built a cage for yourself." The courtroom erupted into whispers. The reporters scrambled to update their headlines. The narrative of the helpless orphan was dying in real time, replaced by the image of a woman who had mastered the very weapons used against her. Yimin watched from his wheelchair in the corner, a ghost of a proud smile on his lips. He saw the Kingsleys realizing, for the first time, that they hadn't sold a slave to a monster. They had delivered a queen to her throne. As the judge called for a recess to review the new evidence, Zarya walked past the Kingsley table. She didn't stop, but she leaned in just enough for Deborah to hear her whisper. "The floor is clean now, Auntie, and it's your turn to scrub." The victory in the courtroom felt like a spark of light before a total eclipse. As Zarya and Yimin exited the granite halls, the atmosphere didn't carry the triumph of their legal blow. It was thick with the static of an impending storm. The Kingsleys hadn't fled. They were standing by the curb, Deborah's eyes red-rimmed, but gleaming with a sudden, sharp malice as she clutched her phone. "You think a few spreadsheets can stop us?" Julian hissed as they passed, his voice a jagged edge of desperation. "You haven't seen the real law yet, Zarya." Before Yimin's security detail could clear a path to the awaiting limousine, the shrieking wail of sirens cut through the city noise. 6 black sedans, flashing blue and red, screeched to a halt, boxing them in. These weren't the standard police. They were the Special Task Force, a unit known to be as effective as they were susceptible to the right price. A man in a sharp, gray suit stepped forward, his badge glinting like a predator's tooth. "Han Yimin," he barked, his voice amplified by the sudden silence of the stunned crowd. "You are under arrest for the suspected murder of Victor Kingsley's business associates and the international trafficking of illegal digital assets." Zarya felt the world tilt. She looked at Victor, who stood behind the officers with a sickly, triumphant grin. They had played their final card, a fabrication so grand, backed by corrupt officials, that it overrode the financial truth they had just faced. "This is a setup." Zarya stepped in front of Yimin, her heart hammering against her ribs. "We just proved their fraud in front of a judge." Yimin placed a steadying hand on her arm. Even as the officers surrounded him, forcing him to stand from his wheelchair for the search, his expression remained a mask of carved granite. He didn't struggle. He didn't even look at the handcuffs as they ratcheted shut around his wrists with a cold, metallic click. "The warrant is signed, ma'am," the officer said, shoving Zarya back. "Move, or you'll be charged with obstruction." The cameras that had once captured Zarya's victory now feasted on Yimin's humiliation. The trillionaire dragon was being hauled away like a common criminal, his empire seemingly crumbling with every step he took toward the police cruiser. As the door slammed shut, Deborah Kingsley stepped toward Zarya, leaning in close enough for her perfume to choke the air. "He's going to rot in a cell, you little brat," Deborah whispered, her voice trembling with spite. "And while he's gone, we're going to take back everything. You're nothing without him, just an orphan with expensive taste." Zarya watched the taillights of the police escort fade into the soul traffic. For a moment, the old coldness crept back into her bones, the feeling of being small, alone, and powerless. She looked at the empty wheelchair left abandoned on the sidewalk, a hollow symbol of the man who had been her shield. Then she felt the weight of the phone in her pocket. She remembered the early mornings in the sanctum, the way Yimin's voice had rumbled as he taught her to see the patterns in the chaos. He hadn't just taught her how to be a wife, he had taught her how to be a general. She turned to Yimin's head of security, who stood paralyzed by the loss of his commander. "Get the cars," Zarya commanded. Her voice wasn't a whisper, it was a blade. "Ma'am, the boss is gone. The accounts might be frozen by morning." "The boss isn't gone. He's just in a different room," Zarya snapped, her eyes flashing with a lethal, focused intelligence. "The Kingsleys think they've cut off the head of the snake. They don't realize that the Han Syndicate is a hydra, and I'm the one holding the torch. As she climbed into the back of the limousine alone, Zarya didn't cry. She opened her laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating her face in the darkened car. She saw the market already beginning to dip as news of the arrest hit the wires. The vultures within the syndicate would be waking up, smelling blood and planning their own coups. She began to type, her fingers moving with the precision Yi-Min had demanded. She wasn't just standing between their empire and collapse, she was becoming the collapse for anyone who dared to stand in her way. The Kingsleys thought they had taken her strength, but they had actually done the one thing Yi-Min never could. They had removed her mercy. Head to the Han headquarters, she told the driver, and call the board. Tell them the matriarch is coming, and tell them to bring their loyalty or bring their resignations. The hunt hadn't ended with an arrest. It had only moved to a bigger stage. The obsidian elevators of the Han headquarters climbed 60 floors in total silence, but inside Zarya's chest, a storm was raging. She adjusted the sleeves of her tailored blazer, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the family crest pinned to her lapel. When the doors slid open, she was met with a wall of men, the syndicate's inner circle, standing in the foyer like a barrier of stone. These were the lieutenants who had served Yi-Min's father, men who smelled of expensive scotch and old-world misogyny. "The boardroom is closed, Mrs. Han," Director Kang said, his voice dripping with a condescension that made Zarya's jaw tighten. He was a man with a face like crumpled parchment and a heart twice as dry. "This is a matter for the family bloodline and the executive board. A spouse has no place here while the boss is in custody." Zarya didn't stop walking. She moved with a directness that forced Kang to step aside or be trampled. "I am the Han bloodline by law, Director, and I am the majority shareholder by my husband's decree. You have 10 seconds to find your seat, or I will have security escort you to the sidewalk." She pushed through the double doors into the boardroom. The air was thick with smoke, and the frantic energy of men planning a funeral for a man who wasn't dead yet. As Zarya took the seat at the head of the long obsidian table, Yi-Min's seat, the room fell into a jagged, insulted silence. "You have a lot of nerve sitting there, girl," growled Elder O, the eldest member of the council. "The Kingsleys have tainted the Han name. The markets are crashing because of your family's drama. We are here to vote on a temporary successor to stabilize the syndicate. You are a distraction we cannot afford." Zarya leaned back, her deep brown complexion luminous under the recessed lighting. She looked at the men around the table, seeing them not as legends of the underworld, but as the same kind of bullies she had survived in the Kingsley household. They relied on fear. She relied on the patterns Yi-Min had taught her to see. "A successor?" Zarya asked, her voice dangerously calm. "You mean a scavenger? You're not here to stabilize the empire, you're here to carve it up before the body is even cold." She opened her laptop, the glow illuminating her sharp, focused features. "Director Kang, shall we talk about stability? Perhaps we can start with the 200 million one you've been siphoning into a private account in the Cayman Islands to fund your daughter's gambling habit in Macau." Kang's face went from pale to a sickly gray. That's a lie, fabricated data." Zarya didn't blink. She tapped a key, and a document appeared on the massive screen at the front of the room. "And Elder O," Zarya continued, her gaze shifting to the old man. "You've been meeting with the Cusin rivals at a tea house in Incheon every Tuesday for 3 months. I have the transcripts of your offer to hand over our shipping routes in exchange for a seat on their board once Yi-Min is out of the way." The room became a vacuum. The lieutenants looked at each other, the bravado draining out of them as they realized the orphan bride wasn't just holding the fort, she was holding their lives in her hands. This was the orphan's wit she had honed under the Kingsleys, the ability to observe, to listen when she was thought to be invisible, and to strike the moment the enemy showed their throat. "I didn't come here to ask for your permission to lead," Zarya said, her voice dropping to a resonant, lethal rumble. "I came here to tell you that the Han Syndicate is under new management until my husband returns. You will use your influence to silence the press. You will use your connections to find out which judge signed that warrant. And you will do it because if I go down, I am taking every single one of your secrets to the prosecutor with me." She stood up, her presence dominating the room in a way that mirrored Yimin's own terrifying authority. "Director Kang, I expect a full report on the task force's funding by midnight. Elder O, you will call your friends at the Kusin faction and tell them the deal is off, or I will leak your daughter's location to the creditors you've been dodging." The men who had tried to push her aside now sat in stunned, terrified submission. They didn't see an orphan anymore, they saw the matriarch. "Any objections?" Zarya asked, her hand resting on the obsidian table. Silence was her only answer. "Good," she said, snapping her laptop shut. "Now get to work, we have a king to bring home." As she walked out of the boardroom, Zarya felt a surge of cold, crystalline clarity. She had conquered the den of lions. Now it was time to hunt the vultures who had put her husband in a cage. The war for the Hand Syndicate was being fought on two fronts, but the most dangerous battle was the one Zarya waged within the silent walls of Yimin's sanctum. While the directors scrambled to obey her commands, Zarya stayed submerged in the encrypted deep web archives of the Kingsley family's past. She wasn't just looking for financial leverage anymore. She was hunting for the truth behind the tragedy that had turned her into an orphan on her 18th birthday. The official police report from that night had always been simple: a brake failure on a rain-slicked mountain road, a tragic end to a celebratory dinner. But as Zarya cross-referenced Victor Kingsley's private journals with the shipping manifests of his failing logistics company from 2 years ago, a darker pattern began to emerge. Victor hadn't just been losing money, he had been drowning. And the only thing standing between him and total ruin was the massive trust, fund, and insurance policy held by Zarya's father. Zarya's breath hitched as she found a deleted email thread from a burner account, recovered from a cached server. The sender was Victor. The recipient was a freelance mechanic known for specialized vehicle disposals. The date on the message was 3 days before the accident. The subject line was chillingly brief: "Make it look like an accident. The girl must survive for the inheritance transfer." "They didn't just take my life," Zarya whispered into the hollow room, her voice trembling with a grief that had curdled into a lethal, icy rage. "They engineered it." She dug deeper, her fingers flying across the keys with a frantic, desperate precision. She found a wire transfer from Victor to the mechanic, disguised as a payment for consulting services, executed exactly 48 hours after her parents were buried. It was the blood money that had saved the Kingsley estate. They hadn't taken her in out of pity. They had taken her in to keep their victim close, ensuring she remained too broken and distracted to ever look into the shadows of that mountain road. The revelation felt like a physical weight pressing against her lungs. Every insult she had endured, every floor she had scrubbed, and every night she had gone to bed hungry was a calculated move to keep her under their thumb. They hadn't just abused her, they had murdered her world and then charged her for the privilege of living in the ruins. Zarya stood up from the desk, her reflection in the darkened window unrecognizable. The ivory silk of her suit looked like a shroud, and her eyes burned with a fire that could have leveled the city of Seoul. She looked at the photo of her parents she kept in her locket, their smiling faces a painful reminder of the life that had been stolen. "They think they've won because Yimin is in a cell," she said to the empty room, her voice a cold, resonant promise. "But they've only succeeded in removing the only person who would have stopped me from destroying them entirely." She didn't call the police. She didn't call the lawyers. Zarya called the head of the Hand Syndicate's tactical unit. The orphan's wit had been replaced by a queen vengeance. She realized then that the Kingsleys' fraudulent lawsuit and Yimin's arrest weren't just attacks. They were the final distractions to cover their ultimate crime. But Zarya was no longer distracted. She had the patterns, she had the proof, and she had the power of the Han Empire behind her. As she walked out of the sanctum, the blue light of the monitors reflected in her gaze, Zarya felt a strange, terrifying calm. The hunt was no longer about survival or protecting an empire. It was about justice, the kind of justice that didn't happen in a courtroom. The Kingsleys had spent 2 years watching her bleed. Now they were going to find out what happens when the girl they tried to bury finally digs her way out. The rainy streets of Incheon were a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers and low-hanging fog, the perfect staging ground for a ghost operation. Zarya sat in the back of a tactical van, the flickering blue light of a surveillance monitor casting sharp shadows across her face. She was no longer wearing ivory silk. She was clad in tactical black, a lightweight ceramic vest buckled over her chest. Beside her, the leader of the Hand Strike team, a man who had seen 100 wars, waited for her command. "The target is in Warehouse 42, Zarya said, her voice a cold, steady hum that cut through the tension. On the screen, a thermal heat map showed 4 armed guards circling a small, reinforced room. Inside was the consulting mechanic Victor Kingsley had hired 2 years ago, the only living witness who could link the Kingsleys to the murder of Zarya's parents and the fabricated evidence used to arrest Yeemin. The Kingsleys had tucked him away here, under the protection of the Kusin faction, planning to dispose of him once the trial was over. They thought they had him hidden in a blind spot. They didn't realize that Zarya had mapped every digital heartbeat of the Kingsley payroll. "Extraction only," Zarya commanded, her eyes fixed on the feed. "If he dies, my husband stays in that cell and the Kingsleys walk free. Use the Pulse EMG to drop the lights. I want him alive and I want him terrified." As the team moved out, Zarya watched the operation with a detached, clinical focus. She saw the flashbangs bloom on the monitor like miniature suns, followed by the chaotic heat signature scramble of the Kusin guards. For years, she had been the one hiding in the shadows of the Kingsley estate, flinching at the sound of a raised voice. Now she was the shadow. She was the one dictating the rhythm of the violence. When the radio crackled with the all clear, Zarya didn't wait for the team to bring the witness to her. She stepped out of the van, the cold rain hitting her face like a baptism of ice. She walked into the warehouse, the scent of gunpowder and sea salt thick in the air. In the center of the room, strapped to a chair and trembling, was a man whose hands had once cut the brake lines of her parents' car. He looked up as Zarya approached, his eyes widening in recognition. He had seen her at the funeral, the broken orphan girl in the black veil. He didn't see her now. "You have 2 minutes to give me the encryption keys for the burner phone Victor used," Zarya said, leaning in so close he could see the lack of mercy in her gaze. "And then you're going to give a recorded statement to the High Prosecutor regarding the accident on the mountain road." "The Kusin, they'll kill me," the man rasped, his teeth chattering. Zarya leaned back, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The Kusin faction doesn't exist anymore. While my team was coming for you, I triggered a freeze on their laundering accounts in Zurich. By morning, they'll be too busy running from their own creditors to worry about you. But me, I have all the time in the world." She held up a digital recorder. "Tell me about the brake lines, and I'll make sure you get a cell in a facility where the Hand Syndicate doesn't have the keys. Refuse, and I'll leave you here for the Kingsleys to find. They don't like loose ends, do they?" The man broke. The words poured out of him, a confession of greed, of Victor's desperation, and of the fabricated logs used to frame Yeemin. Zarya listened to the truth she had known in her soul, her heart hardening into a diamond-sharp weapon. As the tactical team loaded the witness into a secure transport, Zarya stood alone in the center of the warehouse. She looked at her hands, steady, cold, and powerful. She had the witness. She had the truth. The walls around Yeemin were about to crumble, and the ground beneath the Kingsleys was about to open up. "Call the High Prosecutor," Zarya told her lead guard as she climbed back into the van. "Tell him the matriarch has a delivery for him, and tell him to have the release papers for my husband ready by dawn." The rescue was complete. The extraction of the truth was done. Now there was only the reckoning. The derelict warehouse on the outskirts of Incheon smelled of rust, stagnant river water, and the ghosts of 1,000 failed dreams. It was the same hollow shell of corrugated iron where, 2 years ago, Victor and Julian had dragged Zarya to threaten her into silence after her parents' funeral. Back then, she had been a girl huddled on the oil-stained floor, shaking with a terror that tasted like copper. Tonight, she was the one standing in the center of the singular, flickering spotlight, the heels of her boots clicking a rhythmic, predatory cadence against the concrete. Deborah and Julian Kingsley stood bound to heavy industrial chairs, their designer clothes tattered, and their faces pale with the realization that the orphaned slave they had sold was now their judge and executioner. Zarya had bypassed the police for this moment. She needed them to understand that the law of the syndicate was swifter and much more personal than the law of the land. "Untie me this instant, you ungrateful wretch," Deborah shrieked, her voice cracking as she struggled against the heavy zip ties. "We took you in. We gave you a roof when you had nothing." Zarya stopped a foot away from her aunt, the cold light highlighting the sharp, regal lines of her face. She didn't look angry. She looked enlightened. "You gave me a roof so you could burn the house down around me, Deborah. You didn't take me in out of love. You took me in to ensure the girl who owned the Monroe fortune was too broken to ever ask why her parents' brakes failed on a clear mountain night." Julian flinched, his eyes darting toward the shadows where Zarya's tactical guards stood like statues. "You can't prove anything. It was an accident," the police said. "The police said what you paid them to say," Zarya interrupted, her voice a low, resonant rumble. She pulled a tablet from her coat and swiped the screen. On the wall behind her, a massive projector illuminated a grainy, high-definition video. It was the recorded confession of the mechanic they had hidden in Incheon, detailing every wire transfer and every cut line. "The mechanic is already with the high prosecutor," Zarya continued, watching the color drain from Victor's face until he looked like a corpse. "And the task force officers you bribed to arrest Yi-min, they've already been turned. They're trading your names for their own immunity as we speak." "Zarya, please," Deborah whimpered, her bravado finally shattering. "We're family, your mother. She was my sister. You wouldn't do this to us." "My mother was your victim," Zarya hissed, leaning in so close that Deborah could see the absence of mercy in her gaze. "And family doesn't sell their own to the highest bidder. You didn't just want the money. You wanted to erase me because every time you looked at me, you saw the crime you committed." Zarya pulled out a stack of documents, the very same ones the Kingsleys had used to try and reclaim her. She lit a silver lighter, the flame dancing in her deep brown eyes. She watched as the papers caught fire, the orange glow reflecting off the diamonds at her throat. "You wanted a lawsuit," she said, dropping the burning pages at Deborah's feet. "You wanted a fight for the Monroe legacy. Well, congratulations. The legacy is mine. And the debt you owe for my parents' lives is one you'll be paying in a cell that makes this warehouse look like a palace." Julian tried to lung forward, his chair rattling against the floor. "You think you're so powerful now? You're just a Mafia lapdog. Yi-min will throw you away when he's done with you." The sound of a heavy sliding door at the back of the warehouse echoed through the space. The guard stepped aside as a tall, commanding figure emerged from the darkness. Han Yi-min walked into the light, his stride steady, his presence an overwhelming force that silenced the room. He wasn't in a wheelchair, and he wasn't in handcuffs. He was a king returned to his throne. He walked straight to Zarya, ignoring the Kingsleys as if they were insects. He wrapped an arm around her waist, his touch a silent declaration of ownership and respect. "They're ready for transport, my queen," Yi-min murmured, his eyes fixed on Zarya with a pride that burned brighter than any flame. Zarya looked at the Kingsleys one last time. They weren't monsters anymore. They were just small, pathetic people who had run out of time. She turned her back on them, her head held high. "Take them," Zarya said to the guards. "I'm done with the past. I have an empire to run." As the Kingsleys were dragged into the night, screaming for a mercy they never gave, Zarya leaned into Yi-min. The warehouse was empty, the ghosts were gone, and for the first time in 2 years, the air tasted clean. The morning sun over Seoul did not just bring light, it brought a cold, mathematical reckoning. Yi-min stood on the glass balcony of the Han headquarters, his silhouette sharp against the awakening city. He was officially a free man, the charges against him dissolved by a tidal wave of evidence that Zarya had unleashed like a digital flood. But he didn't care about the news cycles or the public apologies from the high prosecutor's office. His eyes were fixed on Zarya, who sat at the long obsidian table inside the office, her fingers moving across a holographic interface with the grace of a concert pianist and the lethality of an assassin. She wasn't just taking their money, she was performing a great erasure. "The Swiss accounts are officially flagged for criminal seizure," Zarya said, her voice a calm, melodic contrast to the destruction she was causing. She didn't look up, but a small, satisfied smile touched her lips. "I've triggered the cross-default clauses in all of Victor's commercial loans. Every property they own, from the London flat to the estate in Connecticut, is being repossessed by the banks as of 5 minutes ago." Yi-min walked back into the room, his stride silent and powerful. He stopped behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. He felt the tension there, not of fear, but of focused, exhilarating power. He watched the screen as a digital map of the Kingsley family's global presence began to dim, one node at a time. "You aren't leaving them a single corner to hide in," Yi-min murmured, his voice thick with a pride that bordered on reverence. He had spent years building an empire through fear and steel, but Zarya was dismantling an entire lineage with nothing but her mind and a keyboard. "Hide with what?" Zarya asked, swiping a file to a secure server. "I've submitted the forensic evidence of their passport fraud to the Ministry of Justice. Their citizenship is being revoked based on the illegal acquisition of funds used to secure their status. By tonight, the Kingsleys will be stateless. No country will claim them and no bank will touch them. They won't just be poor, Yi-min, they will be non-existent." She executed a final command. And a series of public notice advertisements were sent to every major financial journal in the world. The Kingsley name was officially blacklisted. In the high society circles where they had once paraded their stolen wealth, they were now ghosts, poisonous entities that even their closest friends would treat like a plague. Yi-min leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "They thought I was the monster in this marriage, Zarya. They thought you were the lamb I would eventually devour. They had no idea I was bringing a lioness into the den." Zarya leaned back against him, her eyes finally leaving the screens. The glow of the monitors reflected in her gaze, highlighting a strength that had been forged in the crucible of her aunt's cruelty. "They made the mistake of thinking my silence was weakness. They forgot that the person who cleans the house knows exactly where the foundations are cracked." She watched as the final Kingsley account, a secret trust fund Deborah had hidden for Julian, was drained and redirected into the Monroe Memorial Foundation, a charity Zarya had established to provide legal aid for orphans. It was the ultimate poetic justice. The money stolen from an orphan was now being used to protect thousands of others. "It's done," Zarya said, closing the interface. The room went silent, the humming of the servers the only sound left in the vacuum of the Kingsleys' demise. "There is nothing left of them but the names on a police docket." Yi-min pulled her to her feet, his hands lingering on her waist. He looked at her not as a contract bride or a strategic asset, but as his equal. He saw the way she carried the weight of the Han name, the way she had protected his throne while he was in a cell, and the way she had claimed her own vengeance without flinching. "You've given them exactly what they gave you on that mountain road," Yi-min said, his gaze intense. "Nothingness." "No," Zarya replied, her voice firm and filled with a newfound light. "I gave them justice. Now I'm giving myself a future." As they stood together in the heart of the empire they had saved, the great erasure was complete. The Kingsleys were gone, stripped of their dignity and their stolen crown. But as the sun rose higher, Zarya realized that she hadn't just erased her enemies. She had finally erased the orphan girl she used to be. She was a Han now, and the world was finally her own. The heavy iron gates of the Monroe estate, once a symbol of Zarya's childhood loss and the Kingsleys' greed, swung open with a silent, well-oiled precision. A year had passed since the Great Erasure, and the mansion had been transformed. The peeling paint and overgrown weeds were gone, replaced by pristine white stone and vibrant, terraced gardens that bloomed with the same lilies Zarya's mother had loved. But the most significant change wasn't in the architecture. It was in the woman who now walked its halls. Zarya stood on the sprawling terrace overlooking the valley, the golden light of the late afternoon sun catching the intricate embroidery of her silk kaftan. She moved with a quiet, grounded authority that had become her signature. She was no longer the girl who flinched at shadows or the bride who wept on a cold marble floor. She was the matriarch of a global dynasty, a woman whose name was whispered with respect in boardrooms from Seoul to London. The sound of soft, steady footsteps echoed behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Yi-min. His presence was a constant, warm gravity in her life. He stopped beside her, his hand sliding naturally around her waist. He walked with a slight, barely perceptible stiffness, a lingering reminder of the ruse he had lived for so long, but he stood tall, his eyes fixed on the horizon they had conquered together. "The board approved the final merger for the Monroe Foundation this morning," Yi-min murmured, his voice a low rumble of satisfaction. "The Kingsley name has been legally struck from the land deeds. This soil belongs only to you now, Zarya, just as it was meant to be. Zarya leaned her head against his shoulder, her gaze moving to a small, handcrafted wooden cradle nestled under the shade of an ancient oak tree nearby. Inside, tucked under a blanket of soft cashmere, lay their 3-month-old son, the next Han heir. He was a perfect blend of them both, his father's sharp, observant eyes and Zarya's warm, deep complexion. He won't ever have to wonder if he belongs, Zarya said softly, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. He won't grow up in a fortress of glass and secrets. He'll grow up knowing that his mother forged this path through the fire so he could walk it in the light. Yimin turned her to face him, his intense gaze softening as it searched hers. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. You didn't just forge a path for him, Zarya. You rebuilt me. You took a man who was hiding from his own life and showed him that a true empire isn't built on fear. It's built on the kind of loyalty that drives into a storm to save a stranger. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in strokes of violet and gold. The orphan girl was a ghost of a past life, a story told to remind them of where they had begun. In her place stood a queen who had mastered the art of survival and transformed it into the art of ruling. She managed the syndicate's vast intelligence network with a brilliance that made the old lieutenants bow their heads in genuine reverence. And she did it while ensuring that no child in her foundation would ever feel the cold bite of learned helplessness. The Han dynasty was no longer just a mafia syndicate or a collection of trillion-dollar assets. It was a legacy of resilience. As the evening air grew cool, Yimin reached down to pick up their sleeping son, the boy stirring slightly before settling against his father's chest. Zarya watched them, her husband, her partner, and her future, and felt a profound, crystalline peace. The hunt was over, the debts were paid, and as they walked back into the warmth of the home she had reclaimed, Zarya knew that her parents were finally resting. Their daughter wasn't just safe, she was sovereign. Come, Yimin said, holding out his free hand to her. The world is waiting for us. Zarya took his hand, her fingers interlocking with his, and stepped forward into the life she had earned. She was Zarya Monroe Han, and the empire she ruled was finally her own.